and welcome to America Unfiltered with me, Ellie Cohanim, where we'll be discussing the stories shaping America and reshaping the world. From national debates to global affairs, we'll be looking at the stories making the headlines right now. And joining me today is former Chief of Staff of the White House National Security Council, Alex Gray. Alex, thank you for joining us. Alex, we've been hearing a lot of confusing public signaling on what action President Trump is planning to take on Iran. As a former National Security Council official under President Trump, you have been in those rooms as he was making those decisions. Can you give us some insight on the process? How does President Trump make these history-altering decisions, and what is his management style?
Well, I think the thing that we're noticing here that's being so effective at the current moment with Iran particularly is he does value ambiguity. He does value the fact that the adversary doesn't know what he's going to do. And I think he's done two things which are really, really helping on Iran. One is reestablishing deterrence. So we saw after Ukraine, after the Afghanistan withdrawal that was so disastrous under the Biden administration, the United States was just not taken seriously globally as a great power. And between what he did in Caracas with Maduro, what he's done with Midnight Hammer in Iran, he's restored American deterrence. And then the fact that, as I've heard the president say many times, he believes in the Richard Nixon madman theory of diplomacy. The fact that the adversary doesn't ever know what he's capable of doing gives him tremendous leverage. And so I think he's taking those two things, deterrence and ambiguity, and he's using it to his advantage.
Yeah, that's very interesting insight. And at this point, Trump's repeated warnings have raised expectations among protesters risking their lives. Does the U.S. now have a moral obligation or even a, quote, credibility issue, as some reports indicate Secretary Rubio has stated, to take action against the Iranian government?
Well, I think that the credibility issue I'm not so worried about because we're already seeing the president leveraging the momentum and the gains that he's made in terms of restoration of deterrence and the strategic ambiguity to have real world impacts on Iranian regime behavior. So we saw today the announcement that the Iranian regime has basically said they're not going to execute 800 protesters. When has the Iranian regime ever shown mercy to anybody? They did that because they're in fear that President Trump is going to live up to exactly what he said. So that's deterrence in action. And the second thing is, when the protests first started, the regime did something very different than they did in 2009 or just a couple of years ago. They tried to buy off the protesters by offering them a very insulting $7 a month to leave the streets. Again, when has the regime ever shown that type of leniency to protesters? And I think that's directly attributable to the credibility President Trump has with the regime, that he's not going to go and give them pallets of cash for a promise to denuclearize. He's going to actually potentially do something with American power to change their calculus.
Alex, you're also an expert on weapons of mass destruction. As the Trump administration considers its option, can you tell us what role the Iranian nuclear material and missile stocks play in the decision-making for the Trump administration? What might they perceive as a potential threat or risk in carrying out a strike of sorts on Iranian targets?
Well, I think we know that the Midnight Hammer operation with the Israelis definitely degraded their capabilities, but those capabilities, they have for 35 years been making a concerted effort to keep both the missile program and the nuclear program continuously moving forward. There's no reason to think that they're going to stop that. And further, there's no reason to think that failed negotiations that had been done under presidents going back to Bill Clinton would have any impact on their behavior without the threat of credible use of force, which the president established in Midnight Hammer. So I think where we are, president took off, he took negotiations off the table, and he was smart to do that because the Iranian regime, again, they always think that they can use the nuclear program to hoodwink the Americans into making concessions or looking the other way when they repress protesters. The president's made very clear, we're not talking about nuclear denuclearization. We're not talking about concessions. We are focused on using our actual credibility and our deterrence, our use of force, the potential to use force to keep the regime from doing things that destabilize the region and oppress their own people.
Alex, but at the same time, we've been hearing reporting that President Trump heard from his current NSC and Pentagon officials about potential Iranian targets. And so I'm curious, from your perspective as a WMD expert, do you think that there are potential risks that the administration is considering might unfold if they were to take some sort of strikes or actions against Iranian sites?
Well, there always are risks when you're targeting potential WMD sites, and those are factored in. And I think, particularly working with the Israelis have shown that they have penetrated the Iranian regime from an intelligence perspective to an extraordinary extent. And I think between some of the very exquisite capabilities we have on the intelligence side and what the Israelis have done on the human intelligence side, which is extraordinary, I think we have a very good understanding of where the current state of the program is. And when you combine that real-time intelligence with some of the extraordinarily precise military capabilities we have, I think there are certainly ways to continue to degrade the program, if necessary, that we can bring to bear on the intelligence and on the kinetic side. The question really for me, Ellie, is just how much deterrence can we bring to bear to prevent a potential need for that type of strike? And I think right now, the president's doing a very good job of being able to change the regime's calculus just by the threat of force. And we're going to have to watch it evolve. But I think the fact that they know he's willing to use force is right now our greatest weapon.
And the media is also reporting that America's Gulf allies, Qatar, Oman, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, have made the case against U.S. intervention. How impactful do you believe that is?
Well, some of our Gulf allies, obviously, they're in a difficult geopolitical position. Some of them have the Iranians actively trying to destabilize the Shiite populations in their own countries. Some of these places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they live under the threat of Iranian influence every single day and Iranian proxy terror every single day. So they have vested interests and understandable interests in many cases in wanting the United States to take a particular line with Iran. And that's not necessarily the American interest. The American interest here is preventing the regime from suppressing its own people again, the way they did in 2009, and regenerating the nuclear program, the missile program, and regenerating the proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas that are targeting both American interests, Israeli interests, but also, as I said, our Gulf Arab allies' interests.
Would it not be the case also that a Middle East freed of an Iranian government accused of being a destabilizing influence would make Israel safer and promote President Trump's vision of a wealthy, peaceful, and integrated region, which he laid out last year in Saudi Arabia?
There's no question that the Iranian regime, as it's currently constituted, the Ayatollah theocracy, is the most destabilizing, the most dangerous, it is the poison that has infected the Middle East since 1979. And so much of the death and destruction that's occurred in the Middle East, whether you think about who was it that was funding the explosively formed penetrators in Iraq that were killing American soldiers and maiming American soldiers. It was Qasem Soleimani and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Of course, President Trump took out Qasem Soleimani in early 2020. So you think about Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. You go down the list of horrible terrorist proxies in the region. You can trace all of them back to the Iranians. And so that regime has been spreading terror, spreading malign influence for 40 years. No one's going to shed a tear if that regime goes away. I think what we have to be thinking about is what's the balance between, the need for the United States to keep stability, current temporary short-term stability, with what if we were to push the regime over the top, have a change in government there, and then of course there's always the uncertainty of what do you get after regime change, and the president's going to have to balance, long-term uncertainty versus short-term uncertainty.
Within Iran, we've been hearing chanting for the return of Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah of Iran, who was ousted in 1979 Islamic Revolution. Do you think that Reza Pahlavi could help lead transition in Iran?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I was in government, there was always a great deal of question about whether he had the legitimacy to even serve as a transitional figure in Iran after the Ayatollahs. He's shown himself over the last couple of weeks to have more legitimacy and more popular support than maybe a lot of American analysts thought. I think the key here is that, as he has said himself, he is at most a transitional figure to a longer term Iranian post-Ayatollah regime. And so I think figuring out, they're definitely, based on his ability to mobilize popular support in the last week, there's definitely, I think, a role for him. The question is, what is that role? How long-term is it? And again, like with Venezuela, what does a transitional period look like to a more popular, elected, democratic form of government over the long term look like?
You mentioned Venezuela. The Trump administration has said it plans to control Venezuela's oil resources indefinitely as it seeks to rebuild the country's dilapidated oil industry. What reaction can we expect of allies of Venezuela like Russia and China, which is dependent on that oil?
Well, this is all part of the president's broader strategy that he laid out in his national security strategy, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that outside powers like Russia, China, Iran will no longer be permitted to operate in our hemisphere. And so I think, to your question, absolutely, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese are petrified that the president is following through on what the commitment he made in that document, that they're no longer going to be able to exert proxies and spheres of influence in our hemisphere. The Cuban regime has been propped up by the Russians, the Iranians. There's a Chinese listening post 90 miles from Key West on Cuba and Cuban shores. Nicaragua, the Ortega regime that's been a thorn in our side for 45 years. It's propped up by the Russians and the Chinese. We know Caracas was crawling with Hezbollah operatives. I mean, we are finally getting to something that I think people like you and I have watched for a long time, which is that these dictatorships in our hemisphere have been proxies of our global adversaries. And the president is finally saying enough is enough. Rather than us focusing on these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, let's get our house in order in our hemisphere first. And then once we've done that, we can look more expansively. But that has to come first.
And Alex, given what a threat that that new Trump approach, the Monroe Doctrine, as you referred to it, presents to U.S. adversary China, do you think that there can be some sort of a potential response from the Chinese, perhaps asymmetrical warfare?
Well, it's a real concern. And we saw the week before the Venezuela operation, the Chinese were publicly broadcasting that they were conducting combat simulations of warfare in our hemisphere, in the Gulf of America. This is something they think about. Look, they're buying, as you know well, they're buying farmland all over the United States, not just next to key military installations, but they're buying farmland with the purpose of controlling American agricultural production of key crops in specific geographies. You don't do that if you're not planning asymmetric activity, if you're not planning to do something on the homeland. I have no doubt that they are looking at their options. I tend to think, the Chinese have always viewed our homeland. They've literally said this in their strategy documents. They view our homeland as the soft underbelly of the United States. And they do not view themselves. There was a book called Unrestricted Warfare from the late 90s, where the Chinese military said publicly You can buy this on Amazon. They said publicly, we look at the United States homeland as a potential target in the event of a war over Taiwan. So the Chinese are thinking very expansively about this sort of thing. I think what's more likely to happen is they're going to take the president's decisive action in the hemisphere as a clear signal that the president's not going to tolerate meddling in the Western hemisphere any longer. And they're going to go project their tendency for malign influence closer to their shores. But as I said, they're going to keep every option open in the event of an actual conflict to try and bring pressure to bear on Americans where we live.
And turning to Americans and where Americans live right here in the United States, I'd like to discuss the ICE activity in Minnesota amidst an ongoing Somali fraud scandal there. The Trump administration's version of the shooting has been rejected by the Democrat Party state and local officials who say a bystander video showed Ms. Good steering away from the officer. What do you think the safety implications for ICE and Border Control is as they're trying to carry out their work?
Well, it's a very real threat. And I think what we're seeing that really concerns me is you're starting to see Democratic politicians in places like Minnesota. So think Jacob Fry, the mayor of Minneapolis, think Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, using rhetoric that is truly insurrectionary. I mean, they're using rhetoric that is almost justifying violence against federal immigration officers, federal law enforcement in general. It's really shocking that you have elected public officials in the United States at the state or local level who are setting up this contrast between the citizenry and federal law enforcement officers conducting lawful operations. That is really that's something we haven't seen in a very long time in this country. And so I think you really have to start, either these politicians are going to step back and they're going to recalibrate their language, or we need to start holding them accountable for things like this shooting, because they directly, through painting ICE as a predatory, illegitimate force, they are contributing directly to a climate that is promoting violence. And that's just unacceptable.
The officers deployed to Minneapolis are being ordered not just to focus on finding immigration law breaches, but also on tackling people protesting against ICE. Do you think ICE has enough resources to manage what seems to be an escalating situation? And how do you see all of this ending?
I think ultimately, and I think it's unfortunate, but I do think that the president at some point may have to consider using the Insurrection Act and bringing in additional federal resources. Because, look, I think ICE and DHS could handle this if you did not have local Democratic officials and state Democratic officials openly encouraging the illegal defiance of the federal government. The problem is Tim Walz has actually said he would use the National Guard of the state of Minnesota to help oppose federal immigration enforcement. That is an insurrectionary statement. And so if we continue to have this type of destabilizing and just extra constitutional behavior by elected officials, the president may have no choice but to put federal resources, to include federal military resources in. And I think that's very unfortunate. That's something that no American should want. But if it's a question of keeping the legitimacy of federal law enforcement operations and protecting our ICE agents versus doing that, I would have to err on the side of invoking the Insurrection Act if that's what it takes.
And Alex, for our last segment, I'd love to turn our attention to Greenland. Do you think that President Trump is putting U.S. relations with Europe at stake with the Trump policy towards what seems to be wanting to perhaps have some sort of territorial takeover of Greenland?
Look, I don't think that there's any issue here with Europe. I think Europe is creating an issue out of nothing. This is something that American presidents going back to the 1860s have all said, which is that Greenland's essential to America's national security. The president has a number of options. There's a short-term option here, which is to make sure that under our existing arrangement with Denmark, we put more U.S. military assets in Greenland. I hope we do that. We should do that. There are Chinese submarines that are going up and down the coast of Greenland on a regular basis. That's a direct threat to U.S. national security. Longer term, Greenland should be part of the United States. They're going to get independence from Denmark. They've been on that path for 50 years. The question is, when they're independent, who greets them on the other end? Is it Beijing and Moscow, or is it Washington? And so what I think the president is simply saying here, set aside the rhetoric, set aside the European posturing. What the president's simply saying here is, we cannot, from a national security perspective, allow a Greenland that falls under the influence of our adversaries. Now, does that mean they become a territory like Guam or American Samoa? I think that would be the best solution. If that's not the case, then we have to have a very clear relationship with an independent Greenland that gives the U.S. extraordinary access to their airspace, to their land, to their territory. So this is not a President Trump idea. He's pushed this farther than any American president in recent years. But presidents from FDR to Harry Truman to Dwight Eisenhower have all had similar inclinations on Greenland. This is very deeply rooted in American strategy.
And just so our audience understands, beyond what you just explained, what about, we're hearing about natural resources in Greenland that the United States might be interested in. Could you break that down for us a bit?
Well, there is potential there. We know that there are considerable mineral resources in Greenland and potentially energy resources as well. One of the problems is that Denmark has not done anything to develop those resources, to the point that there really hasn't been a geological survey done, the type of survey that American companies do regularly before mining activities. That's never been done in Greenland. We really are guesstimating just the extent of those resources. One of the things that America can offer our Greenlandic friends is, if we come into Greenland, we can actually develop those resources in a way that benefit the people of Greenland, something that Denmark has not done in the hundreds of years that they have had control of that island.
All right, Alex, great. Thanks so much for joining me on America Unfiltered.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all we've got time for. You've been watching America Unfiltered with me, Ellie Cohanim.